Before we bring our amazing guest onto stage this morning, we have a video that was actually created by a student that features students and staff members talking about what they hope to see happen at Sierra College in regards to diversity in the future. So here's that video for you.
When I first started here, it was really scary.
As an athlete at Sierra College, we kind of felt segregated away from everybody, maybe because other people felt that we thought we were better than them or something, you know, since we were athletes or whatever, but that wasn't the issue.
I just kind of think that everyone's in their own little bubble.
The students like to have the confidence and, you know, have that relationship with their professor where they feel comfortable, where they can go up and talk to them.
Teachers, they don't really care for our sport, even when we do give them heads up, like the whole missing assignments, late assignments, they don't have any type of, you know, help for us, so we need extra help with that.
There's a lot of teachers that I feel just do it to get in and out, and it's a job.
There's a lot of people doing phenomenal work on this campus and putting their blood, sweat, and tears into really great programs that are impacting our students' lives in a very serious way. And we could bring in a string of students to tell you their personal stories and how they've been impacted. But until the campus is willing to institutionalize things, and some of it is, but other isn't, then we're not showing a true commitment. And by institutionalizing, it means that there's that there's a standing on campus that isn't subject to someone retiring or leaving or change of position or whatever, that it's here, that we're saying this is significant, this is important to us, and we're going to make sure that it exists beyond the individual who's doing it, right? And I think that that's a commitment that we should see our campus making. Absolutely should see our campus making.
At first, my grade share year, when we came here, we were required to have study hall hours, 4 hours a week, and Coach Sheridan was the coach here at that time. And then the following year, my freshman year, full-time student, it wasn't required anymore, but I still participated and logged in hours, and it helped me get through college because I was able to use the computers, you know, communicate with my teammates on, you know, how to do homework assignments if they could help, and just get help, period.
The Puente, which from there got me interested in the student senators. You know, I went to their meetings because of Puente, and since the Puente program is only a program, we began the club. So we're still working on that. And then from there, I'm doing the senators thing. So I think that's gave me the jump and opened a lot of doors and opportunities for me to do stuff, things that I would never imagine. So it's a great program.
I'm currently the president of the Rainbow Alliance here at Sierra College. The Rainbow Alliance is the GSA, the Gay Straight Alliance kind of club on campus. It is the Rainbow Alliance because we accept all people from different walks of life into our club.
I'm a strong believer that we should create an experience, in this case education, but really across the board, that's free from shame and blame, and that's when people really thrive. And that's the environment that I want to help create at Sierra College.
Growing up in the Jim Crow South, along with our guest speaker, Tim Wise, was a very traumatic experience in many ways. It was also very enlightening about the world and helped create my worldview. I often saw and heard people of color, particularly African Americans, talk about and frame the issue of race and racism and how it impacted our lives and what we could do about it. I never heard a critique from whites who, without rationalization and justification for the system that was in place. And that's the way I lived my life. It didn't change until much, much later when I started to read the works of people like Howard Zinn, Robert Jensen, Joe Fagan, who began to frame America in a way that included experiences like mine and millions of others. And then, much later than that, about 15 to 20 years ago, I began going to a conference called NCORE. NCORE stands for the National Conference for Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education. And it was during that time, at one of the speaking events, that I heard our guest speaker today, Tim Wise. And Tim Wise described race and racism in America in a way that was inclusive of everyone. It reflected how my life had been lived. And he extended that analysis and critique to what it meant to be white and how that was framed in our culture. And then he went on to the other isms and how they all came together to create the worldview that we all have. And so when Andrea asked me to put together a list of people who we could bring to campus today to talk about the issue of diversity, the person at the top of my list was Tim Wise. I became a fan because he represented a viewpoint that I had not heard and that was not spoken. And he did it in a very honest and direct way. And I hope after you hear him today that you will also become a fan.
And my story with Tim Wise starts 10 years ago when I was a grad student in Sandra's class. Yes. Sandra handed out, I remember the very first day of class, she handed out readings on white privilege. Peggy McIntosh, and we watched videos of Tim Wise. And she told me about NCORE as a student. And that year it was in New Orleans. And I bought my plane ticket probably that night when I heard about it and showed up and had my first experience watching Tim Wise speak and immediately became a fan as well. So right now I'm kind of like a 13-year-old at a Justin Bieber concert, so bear with me. Okay. All right, I'm going to give a little bit of biographical information for those of you who may not be familiar with Tim Wise. As you see here, Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States today. Oh, my Michael Eric Dyson quote got cut off. My favorite sociologist, Michael Eric Dyson, is a huge fan of Tim Wise. Some of you may know Michael Eric Dyson from many of his stints on Fox News or MSNBC or CNN. I'm trying to click here. He's the author of 6 books, including the just recently released, Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority, and I believe he has brought some here today to sell. He is the recipient of the 2001 British Diversity Award for the Best Feature Essay on Race Issues. He has spoken in 49 states on over 600 college campuses and to groups across the United States, in Canada, and in Bermuda. He's provided anti-racism training to teachers nationwide and has also trained corporate, government, entertainment, military, and law enforcement officials on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Tim Wise has also appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs and is a regular contributor to discussions about race on CNN. Again, I can't tell you how lucky we are that he was free today, that he was able to come here today. I hope you're as excited as I am. Today's presentation is titled Beyond Diversity, Challenging Racism in an Age of Backlash. Please give a warm Sierra College welcome to Tim Wise.
Even Justin Bieber doesn't get a standing ovation before he's done anything. I mean, you know, at the end he does, I'm sure. But the thing about that Bieber thing, though, is right that whole like excitement only lasts for about a month or two, and then people are over him. Like my daughter thought he was real cool for about a minute, and then that was it. So I hope that I have a slightly longer career than I anticipate he's going to have. But if he saves his money, I guess it's not going to really matter if he has much of a career beyond 17. It's great to be with you here today. I'm always, got to be honest, I'm always a little bit nervous about giving talks that are framed as diversity presentations. Not because I don't believe in diversity. It's sort of a biological fact of life. It's a social fact of life, and it's always been the case for this country. We've always been a diverse place, ever since white people got here and added some whiteness to a place that already had plenty of brown in it. So diversity just sort of is, and so it's neither here nor there. It's fine. But I'm always a bit nervous because in many ways I think sometimes we use that concept of diversity as a way to not talk about much more difficult subjects. It becomes this catch-all phrase, and it means everything that you want it to mean, and it can mean nothing if you prefer that. And when you can take a word and make it mean everything and nothing at the same time, you have pulled off one hell of a feat. And that's what we've done in this country. We talk about diversity rather than equity. We talk about tolerance rather than ending oppression and ending injustice. So I want to make sure that folks understand that when we talk about this topic as it's been framed, that the notion of going beyond diversity is very central to the work that I do. And I think if all we do is discuss diversity in a vacuum as simply all sort of getting along and mixing and hanging out together, that we're going to miss the much bigger issue. The biggest problem, I think, with the notion of diversity as it's usually framed is not just that it can mean everything and nothing. It is that, almost by definition, when we talk about diversity, we are talking about, in some sense, the other. How do we make them fit into our thing, right? How do we get them to feel comfortable at our place of business or of education and learning or in our neighborhood, which is all fine. I mean, that's better than not making people feel welcome. But the problem is when you put all the spotlight, all the attention, and therefore all the pressure on those who were different from whatever the norm is, whatever the dominant group is, then by definition, you're not interrogating that norm. You're not asking whether the dominant culture's way of doing things may in fact be the problem. You're just trying to get other people to fit in with that dominant thing, but we're not actually looking at our stuff to find out whether it might be creating real injustices for those people who are quote-unquote different. So we need to shift the focus a little bit. Not only looking at those who are different from the norm, but at the norm itself. Let me give you an example of what I mean to sort of illustrate the point. I've been on the road now for this beginning of the 18th consecutive year that I've been traveling around the country speaking to folks about these issues. And early on in that 18 years, in fact, I think it was the very first, maybe the second year that I had been out doing this, I went to Minnesota for the first time. Nice place. Anybody from Minnesota originally? Yeah, there's always a few of you. Yeah. There's always a few. And normally they're not nearly as excited about it as you were. I don't know why. I mean, Minnesota's a lovely place, but normally Minnesotans are just very honest, humble people, I suppose. So they normally are just like, yeah, that's me. You were excited, so that was great. No, Minnesota's fantastic, but I'd never been there, and I went there for the first time to speak at a college, and I was picked up at the airport by these, two very nice white liberal students, and, for what that's worth, and I was to learn it wasn't worth much. But they picked me up, and we're headed back outside of the Twin Cities, about an hour or so, to where the event was going to be that evening, and so we're talking a little bit, and they were saying, they were very excited that they were bringing me in for their diversity day. And that sort of scared me a little bit, because when you tell me that you have a diversity day, I think I sort of intuitively can guess what the other 364 days are like. So, but they were young, so I just allowed that maybe it was just the way they chose to phrase it. I wasn't going to give them a hard time about it. I told them, hey, I'm excited to be here too. And I said, look, it would really help me if you could sort of give me some insight to the campus. Let me know things that I might need to know that would help me this evening when I give the presentation about your school. And I'm not sure they understood what I was getting at, because they started telling me things like, oh, this is the most common major, and here's how many people are from this part of the state, and here's, and I mean, that's all fascinating. I could have read that in the catalog, no big deal. This is before websites, really, so. But that wasn't what I was after. I said, no, that's not really what I mean. What I'm looking for is, do you have anything going on right now on the campus, any problems, any issues, any, racism issues that you want me to address specifically this evening so I can make the talk as pertinent as possible to the local community? And they said, well, goodness, no. They actually said goodness, because Minnesotans are very earnest people also, and they, so, goodness, no, nothing like that. We don't have any racism on our campus, and that fascinated me. For a couple of reasons, right? I mean, number one, I'm an anti-racism educator. So why you would bring a person such as that to a place against which there was no racism about which one should be educated, I'm not sure why you would do it. It seems a bit redundant. It seems like a waste of their money and of my time. Now, I had every intention of taking their money, and I was going to give of my time, but it just seemed odd. You bring an anti-racism activist in a place where there's no racism. And so that seemed weird. But the other reason it seemed sort of odd to me was that, I've been white a long time, and 43 years now, but even then, having been white for 26, that was long enough for me to know that when white folks say there's no racism operating someplace, the hairs on the back of my neck just sort of instinctively stand up, because I always wonder to myself, how in the world would you know that? It's like when men tell me sexism is not a problem. Really? Because I'm not so sure we're in a position to maybe be the best judge of that, right? When straight folks tell me there's no heterosexism in their place of employment or in their community or in their school, I'm really not sure that we're in a position as straight and cisgendered folks, cisgendered being a term for those who are not transgendered, in case you're not familiar with the term. I'm not sure that we're in the best position to know. So when white folks say, no, racism, are you kidding? What are you talking about? I generally need to ask a few questions, so I did. I said, well, tell me, how are you so sure that there's no racism at your campus? And they said, well, it's hard to explain to an outsider, but sort of, now this is when they get real provincial, right? Now they're earnest, they're humble, but they are provincial and they get real defensive when you suggest maybe they're not telling the truth. So they said, well, it's this thing we have here in Minnesota. I said, what, really? You got a thing that gets rid of racism? That's fascinating. And I actually said that, but again, being earnest people, they did not sense the sarcasm or even, one may say, cynicism in my voice, and it just went right past them, So I said, that's fascinating. You have a thing? Because I live in New Orleans at the time. We didn't have that thing that gets rid of racism. I was headed to Michigan right after Minnesota. I was fairly confident they did not have it. And I wanted to make sure that if there was such a thing, that I would pick it up at the airport or the corner store, and I would buy enough of it to last me for the whole year, wherever I was going to be traveling. And I said it just like that. Once again, didn't catch it. So it allowed me to be a smart ass, because they didn't even know, So I said, how are you social? They said, it's this thing that we have. It's like our motto. It's like our way of living. It's our cultural sort of thing up here. I said, well, stop teasing and just, sort of tell me what it is. And they said, well, it's this thing we call Minnesota nice. See, she's nodding. She knows. She knows that. All right, Minnesota nice. Everybody from Minnesota knows what that is, right? And I didn't, though, So I said, well, what is that? It sounds like a bumper sticker. It doesn't sound like a thing that gets rid of racism. It sounds like a tourist commission slogan, but that's about it. They said, well, it's sort of hard to explain, but it's like the golden rule. You just treat people the way you want to be treated. I said, really, that works? Because that golden rule's been around like forever. And it has never stopped racism any other place. But you're trying to make me believe that here, in this incredibly cold pseudo-Scandinavian outpost, that the golden rule, given a particular regional twist, has suddenly worked and ended racism as we know it. Once again, said it just like that. And once again, they did not see where I was headed. They insisted it was true. I dropped it. For I felt that if I continued to push, I might end up hurting someone's feelings, so I let it go. But I decided I had to ask around, and maybe what I would do would be to ask some people of color, because I had a feeling they might have a slightly different take on Minnesota nice, So I was back and forth to Minnesota several times over the next few months, and during that time, I had the chance to sit down with African-American folk, Latino folk, Asian-American folk, indigenous Native North American peoples all over the state. And every time I did, I would ask them about this thing that these nice white liberal folks had told me about, this Minnesota nice. I said, what is this? What do you think about that? And they all rolled their eyes. And I mean one of those loud eye rolls, where you actually hear the eyes rotating in the sockets. They all rolled their eyes and they said the very same thing, like they had rehearsed their answer. But in fact, these people didn't even know one another. That's what made it so intriguing to me. And they all said, oh my God, Minnesota nice is killing us. I said, really? Talk to me about that. I figured I might know what they meant, but I wanted some clarification. They said, well, a couple of reasons, right? Number one is we know that it's often just a cover for a much more aggressive and biased reality. You know, we catch people who are very nice, outwardly civil, right, to us at work or at school. But we also catch them talking about people of color behind their back, making racist comments, telling racist jokes, thinking nothing of it when we're not around. So we think it's just passive-aggressive. We think it's a front. We don't think it means anything. But more importantly, they said the problem with Minnesota Nice is that when everyone is so caught up with the notion of outward civility, being nice, quote unquote, it makes it very hard to raise your voice against mistreatment. Because if you're being mistreated, if you're being discriminated against in some way, if you're being marginalized, you have to raise your voice. And when you raise your voice to call someone out, they will accuse you of being what? Not nice. As in, there was no race problem until you people brought it up. There was no problem with sexism until those women started bringing it up. There was no problem with straight supremacy or heterosexism until those loud and angry LGBT folks decided to bring it up. Everything was fine until they decided to open their mouths. And that's what these folks of color were saying with regard to race, that nice was a way to keep the lid on the problem and not to talk about it. It marginalized them. So the reason that's important to our discussion here is that if we do not interrogate the norm, which in that case was this Minnesota Nice thing, which they took for granted, we oftentimes can't see how that norm itself is the problem. It isn't just about getting the other to fit in with the norm, it's about challenging the norm, you see. And we just don't do that nearly enough. So we have to talk about something well beyond diversity. We have to talk about equity, and we have to talk about justice and what that means and what it looks like. We've had plenty of diversity, as I said, in this country ever since its inception. Before its inception, in terms of color and culture and ethnicity, there were hundreds of indigenous nations with very different traditions and cultures before European peoples ever got here. There were actually African peoples here before most Europeans were here. They were dumped by the Spanish off the coast of South Carolina in the late 1500s, well before the Mayflower. We don't usually learn about that in school. So, in fact, African peoples have at least as much, if not more, claim to this land than those of us from Europe do. But we don't talk about the bigger issue of equity, even as we talk about diversity. Think about the job market. It's probably more diverse than ever. I think there's no question that you will find people of color represented throughout the job structure at levels far higher, let's say, than would have been the case 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. Job sites are now more diverse than they would have been. They certainly are on a gender level, slightly more diverse in many ways, including boardrooms on occasion. But that doesn't mean that because they are diverse, they are equitable. A study from just a few years ago confirmed, for instance, that job applicants with white-sounding names are 50% more likely than those with black-sounding names, quote unquote, to be called in for an interview, even when all the qualifications are the same years of experience, same level of education, everything the same except the names on the resume simply being perceived as white continues to give one a leg up. In fact, for applicants with black-sounding names to have an equal chance at getting an interview with white folks, they actually had to have 8 extra years of experience in order to simply have the same odds as white folks with 8 less years of experience. That's not equity. A study from just a few years ago at Vanderbilt University found that immigrants with the darkest skin shades earn on average about 17% to 20% less than immigrants with the lightest skin shades, even when all the experience and measured levels of productivity are indistinguishable. So the same education, the same seniority, the same years of experience, the same observed output and productivity, but simply being darker, reduces one's salary on the course of, a measure of 15 to 20% a year. A study by Diva Pager, who at the time was a sociologist at Northwestern, now she is, I believe, at Princeton. She did 2 of these studies. What they found was that when you send white and black male job applicants out to look for jobs, entry-level jobs don't require an extraordinary amount of training or education per se, but when you send them out and you have them with the same qualifications, the same experience, dressed the same communication style, everything the same except skin color, that even when the white applicants claim to have a criminal record, they are more likely to be called back for an interview than those who are black without a criminal record, even when all the qualifications are the same. That's not 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. It's right now. Labor Department data says what? That African American folk with a college degree nearly twice as likely as their white counterparts to be unemployed. Latinos with a degree 50% more likely than their white counterparts to be unemployed. Asian Americans with a degree about 40% more likely than their white counterparts to be ignored. And right now, as I speak to you, white men who are only 30 years of age that is to say, relatively early on in their careers, make about 1/3 more in annual income on average than black men who are 60 and nearing retirement. That's now. And you won't hear that on the news. You won't hear that from anyone running for president in either party, because to talk about these things upsets the apple cart, right? Upsets the country, makes us nervous, gets people accused of playing the race card simply for speaking truth into the universe. So instead, we talk about diversity and how we need to have more of it, but we don't talk about the inequity that keeps that from happening. It's not just jobs, it's in schools as well. We know, for instance, that the schools in this country, as well as in this state, that serve people of color, mostly African Americans and Latinos in particular, are anywhere from 11 to 15 times more likely than mostly white schools to be places of concentrated poverty. We know from a recent Department of Education study that schools that serve mostly white students are far more likely to have experienced teachers with 5, 10, or even 15 years of experience than schools serving mostly students of color. Schools serving mostly students of color, a disproportionate number of teachers who only have maybe 1 or 2 years of experience, who are being put in the classroom without the background, without the skills, without the training in many ways to perform and to bring those students to where they need to be. We know that even within the same school, when it is diverse, when it actually is a well-mixed and diverse school, let's say high school, for instance, the research recently found, one particular study found that even within a school, the teachers who are the most experienced, have the most qualifications, and the best track record at getting students to perform at a high level are routinely placed in the classrooms where white students are, like the honors and advanced placement classes, where whites are disproportionately tracked. And the students of color and the lower income students of all color disproportionately stuck with the teachers who were the least effective in terms of their historical performance, the least experience, the least qualifications. And so that reinforces inequality right there within one particular school site. It's not just school A versus school B on one side of town versus the other. It's on one side of the building versus another. A recent study from UCLA's Civil Rights Project found that African American students are 2 to 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended or expelled from school, even though there is no statistically significant difference between the rates at which black students and other students violate school rules, contrary to popular stereotype. We believe that folks get suspended because they break the rules, but the data going back 15 years, compiled in at least 15 different studies, if not more by now, confirm that there is no real difference in the rates at which white students, black students, Latino students, Asian students violate school rules that could get them disciplined. But the rates at which some are disciplined are far greater. So we may have diversity in an institution, but there isn't a whole lot of diversity in terms of who gets kicked out of the school. There's not a whole lot of diversity in terms of who gets suspended or who gets expelled or who's in the honors class or who's in the advanced placement class versus who's in the remedial class. Not much diversity there because there's still too much inequity. So we have to talk about that. And I want you to understand that those outcomes that I'm discussing in terms of the job market, in terms of schools, that inequality is not simply because, and I don't want to be misunderstood, it's not because the job market or the schools are littered with overt racists and bigots whose goal in life is to injure students or to injure potential employees. It's not because folks are, by and large, racist in an overt kind of way. It is oftentimes, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, ever, it certainly does, but much more prevalent and much more problematic if we don't think about how to get a hold of it are the much more subtle and implicit biases that we operate with every day and don't even realize we are doing it. And this research now, mostly coming out of the field of social psychology, goes back 15 or 20 years, and yet most people have no familiarity with it at all. It isn't really talked about in our teacher ed schools. It isn't really talked about in the human development or human resource fields. It isn't discussed in terms of its impact on hiring or its impact on how teachers interact with students or its impact on how real estate agents or bankers operate with people seeking out homes or apartments in which to live. It isn't discussed with law enforcement agents in terms of how it might affect their interaction with the public, but we need to talk about it. This research, for instance, which can look at implicit and subconscious bias, not the kind that's overt and blatant, the kind that's so buried but yet nonetheless moves us around the chessboard and we don't even realize it's happening, have found that at least 75%, maybe more, of those of us called white in this country have very significant, ingrained subconscious biases against peoples of color. What's really frightening is even people of color are susceptible to those. Large numbers of Latinos, large numbers of Asian Americans, and about 1/3 of African Americans, when tested for these biases, have also demonstrated strong levels of implicit bias against themselves as people of color. Right? So it's not just white folks who are susceptible to it, but the biases tend to operate in the direction of harming peoples of color. One study which hooked white folks up to brain scan imaging machines and then showed them a subliminal image of a black male on a computer screen flashed so quickly that the conscious mind could not even process what it had seen, but subconsciously it was in fact able to discern what it had seen. When they hooked these folks up to brain scan imaging machines, as soon as the image flashed, again, too quickly for the conscious mind to process, 90% of the participants had a part of their brain, the part of the brain that codes for fear and lights up when afraid, lit up like a Christmas tree right after that image was flashed. Why? Well, it's not because those individuals in the testing room were overt bigots. In fact, they had been tested beforehand and demonstrated no overt conscious bias at all. But when their subconscious was being primed, when their subconscious mind was being tested, they were demonstrably afraid of a simple image of a black man, let alone an actual black man walking into the room, crossing the street in their general direction, right? So that's what goes on in the minds of even really good people. That's the scary thing about bias. It doesn't have to be conscious, and it doesn't have to be overt. I used to do an experiment. I don't do it anymore because I decided it was a little unethical, but I enjoyed it at the time. I used to do, it really wasn't. Yeah, I guess it was. I don't know. I used to do this thing in workshops where I would hand out these pieces of paper with a line down the middle, and on the left hand of the page at the top, I would just have a W, which stood for white, and on the other side, POC, it stood for person of color or people of color. And then I would do this, what I called a word association type exercise with folks. And I told them ahead of time what we were going to do. I said, I'm going to say a phrase or a word. I'm going to throw out an idea, and I just want you, when I do it, to make a mark on the side of the page where you get an image in your head of who it is I'm talking about. So if I say a word or a phrase and you think of a white person, you're going to check over there. If I say a word or phrase and you think of a person of color, whatever color it may be, but a person of color, you're going to check over there. And I said, everybody understand? They said, yes. I said, okay, now here's the trick. I'm going to give you these special pins. So I took out these pins, right? And they weren't really special, but it's amazing what you can make people believe by just telling them. And so I gave them the pins, and they were all the same. And I said, now the reason I want you to use these pins is because, in the past when I would do this experiment, I got a very distinct impression that folks weren't always being honest with me about what they were seeing and what they were thinking. So I decided I needed some form of, for lack of a better phrase, lie detection. So I purchased these special pins. They are the latest in lie detection technology. It's being used by law enforcement officers all over the country who are very worried about, false confessions. When they have you write out the confession, they're afraid they might be false. And so there's a lie detector, there's a microchip in the pen, and it detects sweat changes in the fingertips. I don't even know if the fingertips sweat, but neither did they. I said, it detects changes in the pressure based on nervousness. It detects apprehension. And then I took out my laptop, right, and I opened it up at the podium. And I said, hold on just a second. And I acted like I was calibrating something. I was like checking email, but I had them think. I said, now let me make sure. And then I would act like one of the pins wasn't working. And so I would say, wait, can you screw the top of that just a little? And then they would. And it's working now. Thank you. Okay. So, and then I would throw these words out, right? And they would be words like criminal, drug dealer, drug user, single parent, right? I go through a whole welfare recipient. I just throw out a whole lot of concepts. And inevitably, if they were quote-unquote negative concepts, things that had been constructed negatively in this society, people would invariably mark person of color, even though, of course, most criminals are not people of color. So to see a person of color when I use the word criminal is not rational. That's not logical. That's not the norm, but that's what we see. When I would say drug user, people would almost always put, and there have been other studies on this, when white folks are asked to envision a typical drug user, 95% of us envision a person of color, even though 70% of all users of drugs are non-Hispanic whites. Whites have rates of use that are the same or higher than the rates of use for people of color, contrary to stereotype. But when you throw it out, people mark it, when I would use positive words, right? Things that are constructed positively. I would say all-American girl, all-American boy. They think the pen is going to detect deception. They almost all would mark the white side. And then I would say God, and they would mark the white side. Even the ones in the room who then identified themselves as atheists. I mean, that's heavy. If you don't even believe in God, but the God that you don't believe in, by God, is white, I mean, that's some heavy, crazy stuff right there. I know there's no God, but by God, if there's a God, that God looks like me, right? Heavy, heavy, crazy stuff. And what was interesting, and look, it wasn't just the white folks that did this. The folks of color in the room would do it. The black and brown folk, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, would still mark POC when it was a negative word or concept. And they would still mark W when it was a quote-unquote positive word or concept. How heavy is that, right? That's how deeply conditioned we've been. And for people to have been so deeply conditioned, but then actually be able to look you in the eye and say, in spite of all that, I can still treat people equitably and justly without any problem. I'm sure I can still evaluate a job applicant without any bias whatsoever. I'm sure I can still evaluate a student in my classroom without any bias whatsoever. Is absolute nonsense. It's asking for some Herculean Superman-like feat instead of just being honest, noting that we've been conditioned and then working to try to counter that conditioning as an active way of resisting that which we've been taught. There's no shame in having been taught it. It's not your fault and it's not mine. The only shame is in refusing to acknowledge what is clearly evident, not only from research, but from common sense. And we all know it if we're just being honest for a second about it. But we don't oftentimes do that. So why is it important that we do it? Why is it so important that we address these implicit and subtle biases, which so many of us, virtually all of us, have ingrained at some point in our psyches? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, of course, is to do fairness and justice to others, but it's also about creating the kind of society in which we wish to live. And I can tell you that if we don't address these issues of racial injustice and gender injustice and class injustice and all of those forms of injustice, the problem will indeed get worse. To be colorblind or color mute, to not speak of the problem, because, that's what people say. They say, racism wouldn't be such a problem if we just didn't talk about it so much. Right? It wasn't a problem until we talk about it. We talk about it too much. If we just talked about it less, the problem would go away. Really, I want you to think about any other social problem on the face of this planet and apply that logic to it to see if talking less about it would solve that problem. Let's play a game. Let's think of a few. World hunger. Children starving all over the world, billions of people without enough to eat. If we just don't speak of that, food will miraculously appear on the plates of hungry people. No, it won't. Crime got you nervous? You afraid of crime? I'm afraid of crime. I've been held up. I've been the victim of crime. Maybe some of you have. If we just don't speak about crime, no one will ever get held up at gunpoint again. My God, what an easy solution to the crime problem. We should have thought of that 50 years ago. We wouldn't have any crime today if we just never spoke about the problem. If your schools aren't working for your kids and they're not learning what they need to learn, shh. Everybody will make the honor roll if we all just shut up talking about it. That doesn't make any sense, right? Problems don't go away because we fail to discuss them. They only get worse, and racism is a particularly pernicious example of that. And here's how I know this is true. Now, I think about this now in part through the lens of being a dad. I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, both girls. And, when you're a father or a mom or when you're just a parent, period, I think you inevitably start to look at things. You're asking yourself constantly these questions. How do kids learn stuff? Because a lot of times we don't remember where we learned certain things, right? Unless they were later, like in our academic careers. A lot of things we learn when we were kids. We don't really remember the moment. So then when you see your own kid trying to process things, you're wondering, like, what are they, and they ask you questions like, how does weather happen? And why is it when I flick the switch, a light comes on? How does electricity work? And I have no idea, I tell them, well, Google it. I don't know. I know electricians that don't know how electricity works. They know how to make it work, right? They know how to fix it when it's not working, but in terms of actually explaining it, it's sort of a mystery even to the people who are the most expert on it, right? You just flick the switch and by God, a light comes on. It's fascinating, right? So kids are really always thinking that stuff through. We stop thinking about it after a while, right? Because it's too heavy, but kids are interested. So I think about, how do kids learn race, right? How do they learn about it? Now, the old theory was that people who develop racist thoughts, let's say, were taught that by their parents. They had it drummed into them. And of course, that was true, I'm sure, in many homes. That has been true, and that's true in every country, not just ours. Ethnic biases, racial biases, any kind of biases, yeah, those can certainly be drummed into you by parents or by teachers or by preachers or by, the media. I mean, whatever, it's possible. But I think there's something much more pernicious, much deeper, much more dangerous going on, and that is that children can see with their own eyes disparities between groups of people. They don't have to be sociologists to do that. They don't have to be anthropologists to do that. They just have to be awake to do that. And when children look around, they can be 5 years old, maybe even younger, certainly by the time they're as old as mine, 8 and 10. They can look around, they can see who lives where and who doesn't. They can see who goes to what kind of schools and who, by and large, goes to other kinds of schools. They can see, by and large, who the most powerful people in the society are, the President of the United States perhaps notwithstanding. They can see the quality of the infrastructure in black and brown neighborhoods disproportionately versus white neighborhoods. They can see on the news at night, even if they're only really watching it out of the corner of their eye, they can see who's being locked up and walked into jail on a perp walk. On the nightly news, the first 10 minutes of most local news in most places around the country dedicated to crime news, and disproportionately the folks of color who are being targeted, not because they commit the majority of the crime, but because they are the ones that the media focuses on. It's a lot easier to catch certain people than it is others. Like I said, with drugs, white folks are using drugs every bit as often, but are not as focused on by the media or by politicians nearly so much. So kids can see all that. The problem is, if children can see the inequalities in the society, the economic inequities, the racial inequities, the gender inequities, they will try to figure out on their own why those inequities exist. And unless we give them a lens, unless we give them a frame, unless we give them a way to process the phenomena that they are seeing, they will by definition default to the dominant culture's explanation of those inequalities. And what is that default position? You know it as well as I, because it's the one thing that every one of us were taught in this country, regardless of race, culture, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, gender, regardless of region, regardless of any other factor. The one thing we were all taught, almost like a secular gospel, was this notion that you can be anything you want to be if you just work hard enough. All you got to do is work hard and you can make it. If you made it, it's because you're the best, and if you didn't, it's your own fault. You should have tried harder. You should have worked harder. It's on you. Right? That notion of individualism and meritocracy is the default position of the society. But what happens if we teach people that on the one hand and we don't put the asterisk next to it? Right? It's not that hard work isn't important, but now there should be an asterisk at the end of that phrase that you can be anything you want to be. And the asterisk brings us down to the bottom of the page, right, and tells us what? That thing I just told you is a lie unless you do the following, right? Unless you not only work hard, but deal with these issues of structural barriers like racist discrimination, like sexist discrimination, like classist discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the statement is aspirational, it's not descriptive, but we as a society say it as if it were a description of the here and now, not the place we're trying to get. And when we do that and those children look around and they see the inequalities, what do you think they conclude? Rationally, logically, the child who sees white folks disproportionately up here and people of color disproportionately here, men disproportionately here, women disproportionately here, the rich here, the poor here, concludes logically, without the lens, without the asterisks, that the reason is those people up here just must be better. They must work harder, they must have a better work ethic, they must pray more, they must be smarter, they must have better genetics or better biology, whatever the case might be, and the people down here, they just don't try hard enough. In other words, you end up coming to conclusions about entire groups of people which are by definition racist conclusions, by definition sexist conclusions, by definition classist conclusions. And the thing is, you can come to those conclusions even if you are not per se a racist, a sexist, a classist at the conscious and deliberate level. You may not have any of that overt bias, but simply coming to see the phenomena and not knowing how to explain it and defaulting to the dominant culture's excuse will lead you to that place, even if only subconsciously. And so those children will then decide, and not only white children, right, but children of color will come to decide there's something wrong with themselves. Women will come to decide there's something wrong with themselves. People who are poor and working class will come to think that there must be something wrong with themselves instead of the system of inequality that helps to bring about so many of these outcomes. You see, so we have to be color conscious, and we can't afford to be color mute. We have to talk about these things in order to give our children and ourselves a way to understand and then work around and try to do something about those systems. We'll never be able to do it if we talk less about it. So it means we have to have a color conscious, a deliberate approach. We have to recognize our own blinders as part of the biggest way in which we need to move. What do I mean by our blinders? It's not just our blinders to our subconscious. I mean, by definition, those are there. That's why they call it subconscious. Now, there are some ways to make the subconscious more conscious. There are ways that we can train ourselves to see the unseen, to think about that which is not usually thought of. There are ways that we can force ourselves when we are in a deliberation of some sort. Perhaps it's a job search hiring situation. Perhaps it's a classroom where we are standing in front of students, or whether we're evaluating each other's work product in some capacity. There are ways, and I talk about them at length in the last chapter of my book, Colorblind. There are ways to train ourselves to force a consciousness and intentionality that will allow us to overcome some of those subconscious biases. If you drag the subconscious biases into the light of day and regularly remind yourself how easy it is to fall back into old habits of conditioning, the research says you can actually overcome the conditioning. That's the good news. So it is possible. But you have to get rid of the blinders first. You can't solve the problem that you refuse to see. You can't solve the problem that you deny because you're afraid it makes you sound like a bad person. So if you admit that you have those biases, it's like admitting that you're a bigot. It's not at all. It's simply admitting that you're a human. Right? Advertising works, right? Whether we're trying to sell tennis shoes, toothpaste, toilet paper, or racial stereotypes. Advertising works. Research from the field of marketing and advertising finds this thing called the rule of 11 is generally true. What's the rule of 11? It's this idea that after 11 times that you see a product pitched on a commercial, that's the moment where you may well decide, and statistically will decide, that you need to try that product. The first 10, don't do it. It's that 11th time that you're subjected to a particular commercial that all of a sudden you go, my goodness, I need a burrito at 1 o'clock in the morning from Taco Bell. Nobody needs a burrito at 1 o'clock in the morning from anywhere. But the advertisers know that if they can get number 7, 8, and 9 in on you at cheap programming time, like around midnight, right, that eventually they're going to hit you at 3 in the afternoon with number 11, and you're going to think, I need to try that, right? I have to have Charmin tissue paper because Northern will chafe. I can't use quilted Northern or Angel Soft. Are you kidding? I've got to try Charmin. Advertisers spend billions of dollars, hundreds of billions to convince us. You think they do it just because they like wasting money? Or do they do it because they know it works? If they can sell you toilet paper after 11 ads, how many times more than 11 have we heard racial stereotypes growing up? Or gendered stereotypes or class stereotypes about those who were the quote-unquote other? We've heard them a lot more than 11 times. You think they don't stick? Right? We can make toilet paper brands stick. We can make soda brands stick. We can make tennis shoe brands stick, toothpaste brands stick, mouthwash brands stick, but we can't make racial stereotypes stick. Are you kidding? Of course we can. So it's about removing our blinders consciously, not so we can beat ourselves up for the mistakes that we make, but so we can stop making them. Part of this, when you're a member of a dominant group, is really just about having the humility to understand all that you don't understand. Right? Because when you're a member of any dominant group, and everyone in here, I want to make clear, is likely to be a member of at least one dominant group, right? So white folks may be a member of the dominant group racially, but there may be people of color who, if they are men, are dominant in terms of gender and sexuality. If you're straight or cisgendered, are dominant in terms of sexuality. If you are able-bodied, even if you are a person of color, even if you're gay or lesbian, even if you are working class, if you're able-bodied, you're a member of that dominant group. And so there are certain things you don't have to think about, just by virtue of being the dominant group. Like for those of us who were able-bodied, we probably didn't pay a lot of attention to how we got in this building today. I know I didn't, because I didn't have to, because being a member of the dominant group known as able-bodied people for whom the rooms were made, I didn't have to give it a lot of thought. But anyone who is disabled would have had to give that some thought. They have to give thought to how they're going to get from building to building, how they're going to get from their home to the school, how much time is it going to take if there's a fire in this room, God forbid, how do they get out? in a way that many of us would not necessarily consciously really process. That's a privilege, right? That privilege of remaining oblivious. And that's the thing when it comes to race that we really, as white folks, have to think about. Because we do have the privilege of being oblivious to the lives of other people, and we always have. You know, it's one thing for white folks now to say that racism isn't a problem because we're supposedly post-racial because there's a black president, so, you know, it's all done. Which makes about as much sense as suggesting that the election of Benazir Bhutto, a woman in Pakistan, meant that sexism no longer was a problem in Pakistan, right? Or in Israel or India, Great Britain. They've all had female heads of state, but I think if I were to suggest to any of the women in this room that what you ought to do is pack your bags and move to Karachi, because after all, Pakistan's had a female head of state, so they must be less sexist than we are, you would probably think I'd lost my mind. Because we understand that the success of one individual from a marginalized group doesn't tell us anything about the experience of the other millions of people from that group, but somehow we've forgotten that in our own country. We think we're post-racial because a man of color can become president, right? Has nothing to do with the larger social truth, but we have to remove those blinders. It's one thing to say the problem is not a big one now, but understand something. For those of us who are white America writ large has always downplayed this problem. It's not just that much of white America believes we're post-racial in 2012, it's that much of white America, in fact, most of white America thought we were post-racial in 1963. And here's how I know, because in 1963, the Gallup organization took a poll in which they surveyed a very large and quite representative sample of the white population, and they asked us, maybe not us, but perhaps parents or grandparents, or maybe people in our own generation, depending on your age, asked white folks in 1963, do you believe that blacks, they didn't ask about other groups at that time because the racial dynamic at that point was still pretty much a dichotomy of, you know, a dualism of white and black. They asked, do you think blacks have an equal opportunity to get a good job or a nice house or a good education with white folks? In other words, basically asking, do you believe that we have equal opportunity and equal treatment? And 2/3 of whites even then said yes in 1963, before the civil rights laws were even passed in this country. 1963, the year of the March on Washington. You know, when 200,000 people march in August in the heat in Washington, D.C., one should assume they're upset about something. That something is wrong, but 2 out of 3 white Americans wouldn't have understood, apparently, why folks were upset. It's like they turned on the news that night, and there's Walter Cronkite, and they're showing this clip of the I Have a Dream speech, which wasn't actually called that at the time. That's just how we remember it today. And there's Dr. King giving this talk, and 2 out of 3 white folks, by our own totally unself-conscious admission, are looking at the television and, in effect, saying, I don't get it. Why are these black people so angry? Why are they marching? And that one dude right there, why is he dreaming? What's up? Why is he so upset? Why would anyone need to dream about a wonderful America when we've got one that's obviously so equitable? That's where most white folks were. In 1962, Gallup asked white folks, do you think that black children have an equal opportunity to get a good education with white children? And when they just asked that about schooling, 87% of whites, almost 9 out of 10, almost 90% said yes, that black kids had just as good a chance to get a good education as white kids. Now, in retrospect, we can look back at that and we can see how delusional that is, right? But at the time, rational people believed that it was true. And not just rational, here's what's really scary. Decent people believed that it was true. See, I think most people are good people. White, black, brown, doesn't matter, right? Most folks are good folks, but what that data tells you is that even good people, even decent, caring, compassionate, functional human beings are capable of missing it when they don't have to know any better. See, that's the thing. It wasn't that those white folks were uncaring or cruel or hard-hearted, let alone overtly racist necessarily. It's just that to be white in 62 and to be white in 63 meant you didn't have to know the truth about people of color's experience in this country. And I would tell you that for all the things that have changed since 1962 and 63, that's one thing that hasn't. If you are white in this country, you still do not have to know what people of color experience, because it's not going to be on the test, right? And by that I mean any test you got to take to get into school, to get out of school, to get a professional license, to do any job, you're never going to be asked to actually demonstrate that you have the knowledge of what millions of your countrymen and women experience and what their lives are like. But if you're a person of color, you know that you're going to have to know what white folks think is important knowledge, right? The stuff that white America has deemed critical information in order to be thought competent to do this job or that job. Oh yeah, people of color are going to have to know all of that. They're going to have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know we don't call it that. That's like the point, right? When your stuff is the norm, when your stuff is the dominant culture stuff, you don't have to name where it came from racially. You don't have to racially designate its origin. It doesn't have to be called white literature. It's just literature. It doesn't have to be called white theater. It's just theater, poetry, art. Right? People of color stuff is the stuff that gets designated. Not white folks stuff. That's why, for those who are still confused, let's clear this up, because a couple weeks from now it's going to be February, and somebody's going to say this nonsense again. This is why we don't have White History Month, okay? Because we have several. They just go by these tricky names that we have given them so as to cover up what's really going on. Names like May, and June, July, and August, September. Any month that hasn't been designated somebody else's month, oh, that's ours. Now, we don't have to say that it's ours. We don't have to call it white history, but trust me when I tell you that is what you will learn. And let's not act like we don't talk about white folks in February. We still do. We don't even give the whole 28 days, shortest, coldest month of the year. We don't even give the whole 28 to black folks. Right? That's what it means to be the dominant group. You don't think about that. Doesn't mean we're bad people, right? Most people, like I said, good people, but good people have the luxury of not knowing what other people experience. And if you don't have to know what folks experience, the odds are pretty good you won't know it. It's the same for gender. Men don't have to know what women experience in terms of sexism. I mean, we don't, right? We don't have to know it. If we do, it's probably because a woman told us and we chose to believe her, rather than to assume she had lost her mind or was overwrought or over-emotional or, hormonal. That's what we like to say as men. It's hormones make them think there's sexism. Because apparently only women have hormones, according to men. Right? No, testosterone does nothing to us. But estrogen, oh, that will jack you up. It's the way the dominant group can think. Straight folk, cisgendered folk, we don't have to think about LGBT reality. We really don't. If we know anything about it, it's probably because someone who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender told us about their lives, and once again, we chose to believe them, rather than assuming that they had lost their mind, or rather than assuming that naturally we know their lives better than they know their lives, right? Which is a fundamentally arrogant premise. And in that case, it's a heterosexist premise, just like it would be racist for white folks to assume that those people of color are just exaggerating. We know their life better than they know their life, right? But that's what sometimes we do, even when we don't mean to harm other people. We just default to our own understanding. But in a society that has been so radically divided on the basis of things like race and gender and sexuality and class and religion and all of those things, the problem is when you have that level of division, your default position is not someone else's default. It isn't their truth. It isn't their reality. It isn't their experience. And if we're not able to recognize our own lens, because we all have a lens, and none of them are perfect. They all sort of distort our vision based on our own experience. The difference is people of color know they have one. They know that their lens has been forged in the fires of racial inequity and injustice. They're not in denial about that. It's just sometimes the rest of us who don't see it. Women know that their lens is affected by being women. LGBT folk know that their lens is affected by their experiences as LGBT folk. Poor folk know that their lens and how they see the world is affected by their experience with economic misery. The people, however, who have money, who are male, who are straight and cisgendered, who are white, we're the ones who have the luxury of acting like we don't have a lens. I'll give you an example from recent news, and then I'll be done and we'll take some questions. A couple of years ago, 2 summers ago, I guess it was, when Sonia Sotomayor was up for confirmation at the Supreme Court. Now Justice Sotomayor, but at that time, circuit court judge, right? There was a big uproar about Justice Sotomayor during the hearings because she apparently had said at one point during a presentation to law students of color, I think at Yale, it might have been somewhere else, it was a conference of law students. She said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing but not by much, basically that she hoped that a wise Latina, she was referring to herself as a wise Latina, would be able to bring something to the court, she at that point was in the circuit court, that maybe others would not, particularly that white men might not be able to bring, just a depth of different experience, different knowledge, not better knowledge, not superior knowledge, just different, right? Because her experiences would inform her understanding of the law and of the cases and the facts that come before her. And she was just saying she hoped that that would add to the deliberative mix on the court and render justice more often than not. Not really all that controversial. It's the same thing that other judges have said. Sandra Day O'Connor, when she became the first woman on the Supreme Court, said that she hoped being a woman would inform her understanding and add a different perspective to the court. No problem. Nobody said anything about it then. All right, Clarence Thomas even made the comment during his confirmation hearing that because he had grown up poor, that would make him more sensitive to the poor. He didn't tell the truth when he said that, but he did say it. He did act as though it would make him more conscious, right? Samuel Alito, a Supreme Court justice, said that because of his family's immigrant history, that would inform his understanding of like immigration law. You know, it remains to be seen whether that's true or not, but he did say it, right? So the idea that your experience informs the way you view the world isn't really all that radical. But boy, they made it radical for Justice Sotomayor because they actually attacked her as if somehow she was going to bring a racially biased lens because she's bringing that Latina lens, that brown lady lens, you know. During the hearings, these white senators, right, always these white male senators grilling this woman of color and saying, why do you have to have a Latina lens? Why do you have to bring race and gender? Why can't you just look at the law objectively like us? Right? These Alabama senators, that's what they say. Why can't you just be neutral and objective and, you know, blank slate like us? Right? But that's the conceit of the dominant group. The conceit of the dominant group is that they don't think they have a lens. So those senators think that being male and being white and being wealthy doesn't affect how they see the law. It's just y'all brown folk and y'all women who apparently have a lens that distorts your vision. Why can't you just see things clearly like us? Now that's absurd, right? Because historically, when the court was only made up of white men, I mean, we get the Dred Scott decision, late 1850s, right, that says what? That black folks have no rights that white men are bound to respect. They are not nor ever can be citizens even if free. That decision was rendered by 9 judges on the Supreme Court of the United States who were the most learned and expert and supposedly brilliant jurists of their time. Do we think that them being white didn't affect the way they viewed that? Do you think that there had been some black folk on the court that they would have also said, yeah, by the way, I don't have any rights that y'all have to respect? No, that was because they were white that they could say that. It didn't matter how bright they were, how objective they supposedly thought they were, how brilliant, how educated, they had a lens. The difference between Sonia Sotomayor and those white men who were grilling her and condemning her for owning her lens is that she knows she has one. And what does the research tell us? The research, interestingly, tells us that when we acknowledge that we have one, and when we acknowledge that it can, in many cases, affect how we view the world and individuals within the world, when we acknowledge our lens, which is a way of acknowledging our own biases, we're actually less likely to act on them. So in a strange, ironic twist, it is precisely Sonia Sotomayor's willingness to acknowledge her own lens that will likely render her a far more equitable jurist than the others on the court who don't believe they have one. Because when they don't acknowledge they have one, that's when they become dangerous. And the same is true for all of us. See, that's what this is about. It's about removing the blinders from our eyes, not so that we can feel bad or feel guilty. This is not at all about guilt, white guilt, male guilt, straight guilt, moneyed guilt. It is about responsibility. Those things are not, strictly speaking, synonymous. Guilt is what you feel because of the things that you've done, and responsibility is what you take because of the kind of person that you are. It remains to be seen in the 21st century what kind of people we are and what kind of people and what kind of nation we're going to be, but we had best learn the answer to that question quickly. Thank you all so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Okay, we have a few more minutes where we can take questions if you have them.
I will come out in the audience for those of you who need a louder voice, because I'm pretty loud without a mic. So if anyone wants to raise their hand and have me come to them, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll point you out from here.
Do you have a mic for them, or you're just going to repeat?
She's
Okay,
just screaming.
she'll just yell the answers, the questions. Okay.
We'll do the Occupy, the human microphone.
Yeah. Great. Wonderful. Excellent. Great.
So my question is, what practical applications can you give us for helping to make our students' education and the way that we deal with our peers here to be more equitable?
Well, the first thing I think you need to engage in the classrooms, in faculty meetings, in department meetings, in search committee situations, all the situations where people come together and the opportunity for both conversation and evaluation is present, and that's most of the time when you're in an educational setting, to make sure that these issues of subtle, implicit, internalized, subconscious biases are being raised regularly and often at the very beginning. So at the beginning of the school year, at the beginning of a job search situation, whenever you yourself are doing performance evaluations on other colleagues or particularly on students, to remind yourself and to remind each other about what the research in this area says. So for instance, it's as easy, and this seems trite and simple, but this is interesting what the research has found, is that simply reminding ourselves at the beginning of an evaluative situation about what the research says about how easy it is to fall back into old habits of mind with regard to gender bias, race bias, et cetera. That simple reminder said at the beginning of that process and throughout that process actually is enough in many cases, not all cases, of course, nothing's perfect, but overwhelmingly has the effect of reducing biased decision-making and extending the deliberativeness of the decision-making. So for instance, there was an interesting study done on a mock jury situation where they had a mock jury that, with two different mock juries, heard the same case, and they were made up of white deliberators, in the first group, the case was not particularly strong. It was the kind of case that really should result in an acquittal if you're thinking through the facts. But the first group was not told about the potential for racial bias. The defendant in the mock case was a person of color, and there was a white eyewitness or something, and so they weren't told, for instance, that there's a lot of research that says, cross-racial identifications are the worst and usually inaccurate, and that there's a real tendency when faced with a situation like this to default to our stereotypes, so make sure not to do that. That wasn't told to the first group. It was told to the second group. So you had these two juries, both made up of white folks with similar demographic backgrounds. They get the same case, the same fact pattern. One is told about what the research says about racial bias, other people's and our own, and how easy it is to fall into bad habits of mind. The other group is not told. What they noticed was not only did the group that was told come up with a very different verdict, which was to say a not guilty verdict when that was really the only logical verdict to render, but they also took longer. They actually looked at the evidence more closely. Why? Well, the researchers discovered, really, and talking to them afterward, that they were really trying hard to make sure that they got it right. They really wanted to make sure that they didn't engage in a biased decision, right? So these were good people who needed to be reminded, right, of how easy it is for good people to mess up. The other group, also made up of good people who were not put on notice about how easy it is to mess up, messed up. Over and over again when they would do it with a group like that and not tell them, they were far more likely to convict, and they didn't take nearly as long. They took like half as long or something to even deliberate. So we know that by simply having these conversations regularly and often in a professional setting, in a classroom setting, talking to students about our internalized biases, discussing it, acknowledging that we all have them. Maybe as an instructor, I think it's very important to drop your own veil of objectivity and to be very upfront and honest about your own conditioning. You have to be careful when you do this. You don't want to express it in a way that seems assaultive to someone in the room. It's not about saying, boy, let me tell you how racist I am toward Latino people. It's not that, right? I mean, that's not going to go over well, and, but it's about having this discussion, starting maybe with some of the dispassionate research evidence, and I have a whole litany of that research in my book, Colorblind, and some of it in Dear White America, which is the one that I'll be happy to liberate you of your 15 hard-earned dollars for here in a minute, where we talk about what that research says, but then you can work into the personal narrative as well, talking about how we were conditioned. I like to ask people in classroom settings or in workshop settings, what did we learn about race, and who were our teachers? What did we learn about class, and who were our teachers? Because usually the things that we learned were pretty messed up, and we learned them from our parents or in our homes, people who were not in fact experts to comment on poor people or people of color if we were white, or lesbian and gay people if they were straight. People who were not at all sociologists and anthropologists and experts in this field, but who taught us a lot of the things based on their own feelings and the things they'd been taught. And if we get people to acknowledge how much they've been taught before they ever went to school, right, before they ever actually stepped into a classroom, we can begin to deconstruct some of that. Next question. Other questions?
You're really making me think about our hiring processes. And here within the education, we have hiring committees. We have an EEO rep that sits on every one of those committees.
Yeah.
And we try to bring the issues that you're raising to us forward. At the same time, in almost every committee I've served on, you will hear discussion about fit.
Yeah.
You know, institutional fit within an institution. And you're making me think about our concept of fit as it relates to our own biases that we bring into and the mirrors we hold up to
Right.
the individuals who are interviewing. And I just ask you to comment on that. And
Right.
how can then we work beyond that concept of fit?
Right. The notion of institutional fit, for those who maybe didn't hear real clearly what the question was and what she was talking about, this notion that happens, and it comes up over and over again, and it happens everywhere. It's not just here, as you said. It's everywhere. When people are hiring, it's this notion of, does this person really fit in with our culture and our institution? Well, if you understand that that very question is loaded with race and cultural and ethnic and gendered and sexualized and all of those things, notions, because whatever the institutional culture is right now didn't just come out of nowhere, right? It was created by people who had various identities and experiences. So if we've created an institution that reflects the needs and the interests and the concerns and the values and the perceptions of a dominant group, then you know what? Most people who aren't in the dominant group aren't really going to fit, right? The question is, are you satisfied with that? The question is that their problem or yours, right? The question is, who do we try to change, them to fit in with us or us to fit in with the world, right? Because the majority of people in this state already, the majority of people in this country in 40 years, and the vast majority of people on the planet since the beginning of time have been people of color. They have been poor. They have been women, right? They do not speak English. They are not Christians, which is to say that the vast majority of people on this planet with whom we have to now interrelate in a global environment do not look, sound, pray, or act like, on a daily basis, the dominant groups in this country. That ought to tell you right there, the problem is not them fitting in with us, it's us fitting in with them. We've isolated ourselves from the world. We've created this bubble that isn't going to very much longer work for any of us. So we have to ask those questions. We have to ask, what does it mean to talk about fit? We have to ask not just that. We have to ask about the standards that we're using to evaluate. One of the other additional things I would say that both blends answer to your question and yours, in terms of practical things to do. You know, we think about when we hire people, for instance. We think, because we're good people, right? Most of the time, your search committee is not made up of people who that night are going to go burn a cross on someone's lawn, right? I mean, I will just take for granted that there are no, I will just stipulate right now that I assume there are no grand dragons of anything on the search committee. And if I'm wrong, please do not tell me until I'm out of town. I will assume that for the sake of argument, folks are good people, want to do the right thing, and think that we're objective, think that we're fair-minded, think that we evaluate people objectively. Now, all the research that's ever been done on this subject says that that is delusional. All of the research. I don't mean like most of it and I'm cherry-picking. I mean all of the research says that we tend to spot merit more quickly in someone who reminds us of ourselves. And the things that remind us of ourselves tend to be gender identity, sexual identity, perhaps class, if we can perceive that, and certainly color, right? That those are the things that we see. So when a person of color does something in a job interview that reminds us of a stereotype, right? It could be something real innocent or innocuous, like what we all do, maybe end a sentence with a preposition, mispronounce a word from time to time, not answer a question put to us in the interview quite as quickly and quite as perfectly as we wanted. If that triggers a stereotype of inferior capacity in that particular person because of their group membership, that, according to the research, is what ends up sticking in our brain. If a white person does the same thing, it goes in one ear and out the other. We forget it as soon as it happens. This is why, and I don't mean for this to sound partisan, it just simply is what it is. The last president of the United States could mispronounce words with a regularity unparalleled in the history of the republic. And I say this, look, he would admit this. One thing I liked about him was he was humble enough to sort of joke about his own malapropisms and his own inability to speak, consistently in the language of his birth and rearing. He made jokes about it himself. So I'm not trying to be cruel here. But here's the thing. He could. And when George W. Bush mispronounced words, made up words, said sentences that made no sense, right? Not one of us in the room who's a white man said, oh my God, that's it. They'll never hire us for anything again. But every person of color in this room knows that if Barack Obama had mispronounced anything on the campaign trail, anything, and triggered a remembrance of a stereotype about black incapacity, he wouldn't be President Obama right now. He probably wouldn't even be Senator Obama. We're not sure what he'd be doing, but he'd be done, because that would stick in our minds. Same thing with women. Women know the bar is set differently. If women express emotion, that comes across as, not being balanced. If men express emotion, they're go-getters who are, exciting, and they're going to bring energy and passion to the work, right? We don't want women to do that, even though it's the very same thing. We're just looking at it differently. So what that means for our searches is we've got to have an open and honest discussion about what are our criteria, how might they be skewed by race, gender assumptions, class assumptions, and how can we double check and just check ourselves? And again, simply raising, or even something like credentials, right? The most objective thing, ostensibly, that you could look at for hiring is the resume itself, your experience, how many years of experience, what kind of experience, quantitative and qualitative factors of credentialing. Well, is it really objective? Let's think about it. If I'm being color conscious, if I'm being gender conscious, if I'm being class conscious, then I realize that for people who are of color, folks who are women, folks who are working class in terms of their background, that it may be that they might look not as impressive on paper because, why? Because if you haven't had the same opportunity, if you weren't in the pipeline early enough like some of the other folks in the dominant groups were, you may not have the same seniority or experience. You may not have had exactly as much time to accumulate the credentials that someone else had. But should that be held against you? Well, in a colorblind world, it would be. Colorblind world, we would just say, oh, well, this person has 3 more years of experience. That's it. They're the best. Or this person, if it was like a grad school, this person has a higher test score, so they're the best. But if you've had a head start, if your group has had a head start, you're supposed to have a better test score. It's like having an 8-leg relay race. If you had a 5-lap head start, you should cross the finish line first. That's the way that works, right? And in fact, if you start out ahead and you don't cross the finish line first, there's something wrong with you. More to the point, if you start out ahead and the other person or other group closes the gap, even if they end up a little behind, let's say you're 5 laps ahead, but at the end of the race you're only 3. Who's the faster runner? Not the one who had the 5-lap head start, the other one. So we have to think about merit and qualifications in a holistic way, in a way that actually, to the most extent possible, thinks about the different reasons that people do or do not have on paper credentials. And I'm distinguishing those from actual abilities and talents because they're not always the same. So having that conversation, there's no one way to do it, one way to fix it, but having the conversation about it on a regular basis, according to the research, is oftentimes sufficient to get us to look at things twice and 3 times and really think about it in a far more equitable way. Other questions?
Was my picture, and I was really hesitant to put my picture up because I didn't want my online students to know what race I was because they might assume negative things. Because when I come in to teach, they ask me questions like, well, do you have a degree? And I don't think my counterparts get that. So I not only have a degree, I have a UC Berkeley degree, master's in mathematics, and taught 25 years. And I have to prove myself because there's a cloud above me, around my head that says I have to be. It's just hard.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying what you said, and I appreciate particularly in this setting that you said it, because it is not easy, and that's an understatement of, I'm sure, biblical proportions, to put one's stuff out there in front of one's colleagues who do not, as I'm sure, as you've pointed out, have to think about that in the same way. And you're right, the online piece makes that harder, doesn't it? Because at least in the classroom, if that's going on, you can deal with it right there. I mean, you can actually talk to that person, but when it's online, where you're not having that higher level interaction where a person can see on a daily basis your skills as an educator, right? It's easier for them to then fall into those patterns just based on what they see. And that's something to really think about for folks who are doing online ed. I mean, that's a wave of the future, at least one wave of the future, and it needs to be thought about. How will gender biases and disrespect creep in? How will racial biases and disrespect creep in? What will the perceptions of students be? Well, there are ways to minimize what you experience in the sense that we need to engage our students on the campus around those conversations so they don't jump to those conclusions. But it's absolutely true. And the only way that that's going to stop is that those in this room who don't have to think about what she just said have to start thinking about what she just said and have to start challenging themselves and their students and have to, raise these kinds of issues and to really discuss them with one another and what it means that a colleague with the level of experience and credentials, as you just heard, would have to continually prove oneself over and over and over again and, may be still, I don't know how you all do like faculty evaluations done by students. I know a lot of schools, of course, do them, and there's a litany of research that says that professors of color and female professors of all color often have disproportionately lower evaluations, particularly from white students and white male students especially, having nothing to do with their actual work product. I mean, I remember one extreme example, but it just makes the point. Several years ago, African-American female who was a lit professor who was teaching a class called African-American Women's Literature. That is the name of the class, right? And at the end of the year in the student evaluations, one of the students complained quite loudly, "All we learned about in this class was black women writers." Right? Yes, that's why it was called that. Right? And that's, that's the kind of thing that, again, is an example of how one is constantly having to prove oneself over and over. And that's not a minor physiological or psychological toll on the person who has to do it. That's what, in the literature we call it a microaggression, but I'm sure in many instances it feels like a macroaggression. So we all need to be very mindful of it, and I appreciate you sharing it. Next question.
One more here.
I don't need a microphone, Jennifer, but thank you.
Well, I'll tell you what I do, at least as regards racist humor or racist comments, and it also can work for homophobic comments and Islamophobic comments and things of that nature. It can, work in a lot of capacities. And I talk about it in my book, White Like Me. It won't work for everyone, but I think it will for many of you. It's a good story, and it's funny, and it actually does work. Many years ago, I was asking this question because I kept getting asked it by students. They would say, how do you respond to racist comments without being sort of the one who just doesn't have a sense of humor? Like, they wanted to actually make the person think. They just didn't want to just shut them down, right? And at first, I got annoyed by the question because I was like, really? We got so many bigger issues, and you're worried about jokes? But then I realized, you know what? That's where they were. That's what happens on a day-to-day. If you don't know how to respond to a joke, you're never going to know how to fight the institutional power structures of oppression. Like, that's a lot bigger than a silly joke, right? So I started thinking about it, and what I did is I decided I had to come up with an answer because I didn't like my normal way of doing it either. My normal way of dealing with it was either to really jump down the person's throat, and that never did anything. It never really made me feel any better, and it certainly didn't change them, and it usually just created more conflict. And the other approach, I'm ashamed to say, occasionally I wouldn't do anything. I just sort of nervously laugh it off and act like it hadn't happened, which is clearly not acceptable. So I'm thinking of different ways, and I came up with one, and I had to practice it in the mirror for reasons that you will, because I really had to sell this thing that I was going to do. So I finally got a chance to do it. I was in, I think it was North Dakota. It was somewhere where the students had brought me in many years ago, and we went out to eat afterward. And it was all white students who had brought me in, and so it was all white folks sitting at this table at like an Applebee's or something. And we're eating dinner after the event. And some other students come up who had not been with us originally. They had not been to the talk that night. There were no posters of me on the campus, so nobody really knew what I looked like. And I was still like young enough, and I didn't have kids yet, so they hadn't sucked the life out of me, and I didn't. And I didn't have facial hair, so I looked like I could really easily be an undergrad student, and I was dressed sort of casually. So we're sitting around, these students come up, they don't know who I am, they don't know why we're there. This one guy says, hey, can we join you? We say, yeah, they come, they sit down. And then this one guy who had asked if they could join us, after a few minutes, he says, hey, I've got a joke, do you want to hear it? Well, I did not want to hear it. Because I just had a sense, based on my own experience, that this was not going to be a good kind of joke. I've described this as white bonding. This is something that sometimes white folks do when only other white folks are around and they think it's okay. Men do it too, telling sexist jokes or making sexist comments, right, about women when women aren't around. We do it when they're around too, sadly, but especially when they're not. So I just had a feeling, even though I didn't know this kid, right, that this was not going to be good. And sure enough, it was a horribly anti-black racist joke. And I'm not going to repeat the joke. It's that bad. But here was my chance. Here's my chance. I've got my chance to respond. What do I do? So I look at the guy. And, of course, now you can imagine the committee, right? Here I am. I'm the guy they brought in to call out racism. And this kid just did racism like right in front of me. You know, they are just like, oh, hell yes. This is about to get good. We came for this. This is worth the money that we spent on this dude. It is going to get hot in Applebee's. They start pushing their seats back, you know. But they didn't know what I was going to do. I hadn't talked about it, right? I hadn't talked about this with anybody. So I really freaked him out because what I did was I started laughing like it was the funniest joke I'd ever heard. I did it so I could gain the guy's trust. Now, you know, now the committee's totally confused, right? Like, wait a minute, that's the anti-racist guy, and he's laughing at racism. What the hell? Let's get our money back. You know, now they're like, what's going on? So I sell this guy on thinking that it's really funny. I gain his trust, and I said, as I'm laughing, I'm like, hey man, I've got one. Do you want to hear it? And he goes, yeah. Right? He figures I've got one. It's gonna be even better. He'd tell all his buddies, right? So I said, did you hear the one about the white guy who told this really racist joke in a room full of white people, or at least he thought they were all white? And he looked at me, sort of like you're doing now, and he was puzzled, you know. And he said, no, I haven't heard that one. Right, not realizing that he's the joke, right, like, talking about him. He said, I haven't heard that one. How does it go? And I said, well, actually, there is no joke. I was just telling you that because although I'm sure you think I'm white, I'm actually black. My mother is black. This is the part I had to practice in the mirror. Because it's a lie of some magnitude, but I had to sell it. And see, I can still sell it. See, some of y'all, when I said it, some of y'all were like, that's why. I knew there was something different about this white man, and that's it. Right? So I said it. I sold it, just like I sold some of y'all. And so I said, I'm black. My mother is black. And I just looked at him. Now, what do you think he did? He apologized profusely. He was horribly embarrassed, right? He turned 5 different shades of red, and he says, oh my God, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. If I'd known, I never would have told that joke. And right? And here, see, I've got him now. I've got him now. Because then I looked at him and I said, well, actually, it's no big deal. My mom is actually not black. She's white. I'm white. Now he's really confused. Because it's not often that white folks claim to be black when we're not. There's not a lot in it for us most of the time. I mean, it usually doesn't help us. It doesn't. We don't get jobs that way. They don't give us a big house, you know, it's not a lot of perks. But now he's totally confused. He does that thing that dogs do when they hear a high-pitched whistle, something like that. And I said, actually, I'm white. I'm as white as you are. But I do find, but he was so stunned he couldn't talk. And I knew this would happen. And I said, well, I just find it interesting, right, that a second ago when you thought I was black, you apologized. So like at some level, you know that was messed up, right? See, I'm not being aggressive. I'm not being mean with him. I just said, so at some point, you know, right? Like you apologize. You know that was the wrong thing to do. And before he could say anything, I said, so here's my question to you. Why is it that you think so little of white people? Now, see, he didn't expect that question. He might have wondered if I was going to ask him why he didn't like black people very much, but I didn't really care why he didn't like black people. I don't have the time or the inclination to try to change his mind on something that I probably don't have enough time to change his mind on, at least not that night at Applebee's. But I said to him, why do you think so little of white people? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, it just seems odd to me that you would, in a group of people, some of whom you do not know, right, would assume that since they're white, they'll be cool with racist humor. Like, it just seems to me that that's disrespectful of white folks. Because it's sort of like saying to white folks, we're all a bunch of racists, right? Right? It's like men telling sexist jokes. It's like what they're saying, it's not just disrespectful to women, it's disrespectful to men. It's like saying, so we're all a bunch of pigs here, right? Instead of realizing, actually, as a man, I'd like to think that we're not all sexist pigs, and at least that we don't have to be that. I'd like to think that as white folks, we're capable of something better. The irony is, if I were to stand up in front of that guy, if he'd been in my audience, if I had said that night, you know what, all white people are racist, he would have been angry. He would have yelled at me. He would have said, how can you say that? I didn't say it. He said it by way of his actions. He said it. He implied it, because if he didn't think it, he wouldn't have taken the chance in front of white people that he didn't know. See, that is the dirty little secret of racism and sexism and all these things, is that they don't just degrade the people against whom they are deployed, they degrade the people who deploy them, and they say that at the end of the day, they don't respect themselves or the other people in their own group. And I tell you, I've done this 7 times, and every time, that person and I, the person who told the joke and myself, we end up having an incredible 20, 30, 45-minute conversation about issues of race. And I promise you, in that situation, that young man and the other 6 that I've done this with, guarantee you they're not going to try it again. Their behavior is going to change because they're going to have to ask themselves the next time that they're in a group of people, not all of whom they know, and they think about telling a racist joke, they're going to have to ask themselves one simple question. Are these real white people, or are these some of those black white people? Thank you. Thank you.
I've been informed that he does have some books up in the library that just came out recently. If any of you want to purchase the book, he has them up there for sale. Okay, stand up. In the lobby? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
In the lobby.
Okay. I'm also using one of his books in my class this semester, White Like Me. So if you'd like to go to the bookstore, you can pick up a copy of that as well. Okay, in wrapping up, so we are, right?
Stand up. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say that I hope you can now see why both Jennifer and I were so excited to have Tim Wise here. He is just a phenomenal being, and we really do appreciate the knowledge that he shares. So if we could give him one more.
You want me to go through the upcoming activities first? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to quickly wrap this up because I know we're running a little bit late, but I want you guys to get some food in your bellies. But I want to talk about some things coming up at Sierra College this spring for you to look for in regards to our work toward equity. So first, we have a new web page coming up on the new website, and it's called Diversity ? And this was spawned from the great mind of Reyes Ortega. And what it is a place where you can anonymously go with any question you have about any group in society. You can click on that group, you can see other questions that have been posed, see answers that have been posted. We have experts throughout campus who have agreed to take certain fields of questions. So everything from, we've seen questions like, what's the difference between Hispanic and Latino? Or what happens when students use the N-word in my classroom, but it's used in a friendly way, what should I do? Questions like that. Okay, so any question that you want to pose, and then we all can see the questions and the answers, but it's 100% anonymous. So we really encourage you to take advantage of this great resource. Love Your Body Week. This semester, March 19th through 22nd, and part of Love Your Body Week is we're coupling that with the Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series, and the topic this year is reproductive justice. Does a woman have a right to choose? And look at that panel. It is amazing. So we hope you all can make it to that on March 22nd. We have the first ever on campus totally dedicated Math D class for New Legacy students, historically underrepresented students, so we're really excited about that. And of course, don't forget every semester, the Puente program, the Emoja program, the Spectrum Committee, the Cultural Activities Calendar, which Sandra will be putting in your mailboxes very soon, and various other student clubs and committees you can join.
Okay, in closing, many of us already talk about the issues that Tim raised. So I want to have you stand as I read these statements, and I'd like you to remain standing throughout the exercise. It's short. Please stand if you teach about issues of race and racism in your classes. Please stand if you teach about issues of gender and sexism in your classes. Please stand if you interact with students with special needs. Please stand if you teach about issues of sexual orientation and the LGBT community. Please stand if you'd like to join together in creating an equitable community at Sierra College. So I want you to take a minute and look around and see who's standing.
And while we are standing, I want to take a moment of silence. We lost a student on New Year's Day. For those of you who may have read the news, Jeff Fair attended Sierra College last semester, and he hung himself on New Year's Day due to gay bullying. So if we could please bow our heads and take a moment of silence for him. Thank you. Last minute reminders. Tomorrow morning is the faculty breakfast. Full-time and part-time faculty are welcome. Please be there at 8:30 at the Sunset Center. That's at 2650 Sunset Boulevard. And in the lunch cafeteria for lunch, there's going to be 4 lines today in case it is starting to rain. So make sure you can enter both from the bookstore side and this side on our side here. And if it is raining, you can hang out in the fireside room if the lines get too long. Okay, so no one's stuck out in the rain. Thank you all for coming.
Yes.